Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're doing a deep dive into just one source.
Right. A single audio recording. It's from Right Wing News, and the title is Jeff Sessions Smear Over.
Yeah, and it really takes on those, the accusations of racism that you often hear leveled against Jeff Sessions, tries to debunk them.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So our mission here is to figure out precisely what this source is claiming, how it's making its arguments, and just understand the specific viewpoint it's pushing.
It presents a very, very particular take on why these accusations get made and, well, what it claims is the real story.
And you can tell right away the source sets a very specific stage. It kicks off by linking political reactions, especially things like the idea that mass amnesty is over.
Hmm.
It links that directly to accusations of racism or, Jim Crow comparisons that it says come from liberal circles in the media.
Right. And the host of this source recording, they call themselves the Voice of Reason, is actually really upfront about the goals.
Yeah, they say it's twofold. First, okay, maybe get a rise out of liberals with the title, provoke a reaction.
Yeah.
But second, and they really stress this part, is to debunk what they call specific myths about Sessions and any alleged racist ties.
Myths that, according to this source, liberals just accept without really knowing where they came from or having any, solid examples.
Exactly. The host flat out says most people have heard he's racist, probably from the media, but they can't actually give you examples. Why? Because in this source's view, there just aren't any real ones.
Except, they say, for some remarks from way back in 1986 that got taken out of context, twisted, basically.
Right. So the whole strategy seems to be challenging the very foundation of these claims right from the start.
Okay, so after setting that stage, the source then gets into the specifics, right? It goes through some of the common points used against Sessions and offers its counterarguments. Where do they start?
They kick off with what they label the main accusation, the linchpin, they call it.
Which,
That Senator Sessions supported the KKK. According to this source, that entire claim comes down to one single comment made during his 1986 judgeship hearings.
in that specific remark, the source points to, I thought those guys were okay until I learned they smoked pot. That's the one.
That's the one. And the source's whole interpretation is this was sarcasm, purely a joke, meant in jest, specifically a joke about pot smoking.
Not about the KKK being okay.
No, the source claims the KKK members were just, the other people in the conversation where this supposedly happened. The joke was about the pot. And they argue that this crucial context that it was framed as a joke about drugs is missing. Because, according to them, the mainstream media deliberately leaves it out. So you see the technique. It's about completely recontextualizing that one single quote from decades ago.
Wow. Okay, so the argument against the most serious accusation really hinges entirely on interpreting intent, on saying you didn't get the joke,
Yeah.
and providing this different context for one line from 86.
Pretty much.
Okay, so moving beyond specific comments then. The source also tackles criticisms about policy, specifically Sessions and the Voting Rights Act. That's often brought up by critics as, well, evidence of racism.
Yeah, and what's interesting here is how the source reframes this issue, too. They argue Sessions' problems with the act aren't about stopping people voting based on race. Not at all.
So what is the issue, according to them?
The source claims his concerns are really with the Voting Rights Act itself, specifically that it hasn't really been amended much since 1975.
And this lack of updates, the source says, has led to, what was it, racial gerrymandering.
Yes, exactly. The source argues that voting districts are now being carved up specifically based on race, and that Jeff Sessions' opposition isn't to the whole act, but to portions of it.
And they claim his goal is actually to benefit minority groups.
That's the claim. That his opposition is actually meant to help the very people Democrats say he's trying to hurt. Now, just for some, neutral background here, the Voting Rights Act was obviously landmark legislation aimed at knocking down barriers preventing African Americans from voting.
Right. And racial gerrymandering.
Generally, yeah, that means drawing district lines to put a racial group at a disadvantage, but this source is using its own interpretation of that term, arguing Sessions' motive is the opposite of what critics allege.
And the source suggests people don't understand this because...
Because, they argue, it requires knowing the details of the VRA and gerrymandering, which they suggest the public generally lacks, and Democrats, they claim, exploit this with easy headlines and sound bites.
Okay, this deep dive continues as the source looks at other specific accusations it tries to shoot down. There's one claim that Sessions apparently called a white civil rights lawyer a disgrace to his race.
Right. And the source's approach here is, well, pretty dismissive. They just label it hearsay, meaning they say there's just never been any actual proof, nothing to quantify it, nothing to back it up. And they attribute this accusation specifically to a Justice Department figure, a guy named Gerald Herbert. Again, just for context, hearsay is typically secondhand information, often not admissible in court because you can't cross-examine it.
Okay, but the source doesn't stop at just calling it hearsay, does it?
No, it goes further. It makes a point of noting that the same guy, Mr. Herbert, apparently later faced some trouble himself, accusations about trying to bribe witnesses, making false statements.
And the source pretty much tells the listener to do the math on his credibility.
Exactly. So the strategy isn't just denying the claim about Sessions, it's actively trying to undermine the credibility of the person who reportedly made the accusation in the first place.
So, attacking the accuser to dismiss the accusation.
That seems to be a key tactic here, yes.
Okay, what's next? The source also tackles comments Sessions allegedly made about some prominent civil rights and religious groups. NAACP, SCLC, Operation Push, National Council of Churches.
Yes. And the reported comments were things like calling them un-American organizations teaching anti-American values, and specifically calling the NAACP a commie group.
Wow. And how does the source handle those? Does it say they were taken out of context too?
No, actually, this is where it shifts gears. The source's host doesn't try to explain these away. They fully agree with the alleged assessment attributed to Sessions.
They agree.
Fully. The host states that, in their view, the NAACP and these other groups are basically bastardizations of what they originally were. And they explicitly equate them with far-left liberal groups. Liberalism, progressivism, communism, socialism, seeing only, like, minor differences.
So the source's argument is essentially, Sessions might have said those things, but he was right, and calling them commie groups isn't racist, it's just politically incorrect.
That's exactly how they frame it. It's presented as a political assessment, maybe blunt, maybe not PC, but not racist according to their perspective. The host even says, look, if calling these groups commie groups makes Sessions a racist, well then, I'm a racist too. And they assert they don't have any racism in my body.
Quite the defense strategy there. Okay, so finally, there's one more from the 1986 hearings. The accusation that Sessions called his black lawyers boy.
Yes. And the source, again, links this specific claim straight back to that same individual, Gerald Herbert.
The one they already tried to discredit over the disgrace to his race comment.
The very same one. The source connects Herbert to the bribery and false statement accusations again.
Okay, so the source's overall position seems to be that both the disgrace to his race comment and this boy comment accusation hinge entirely on the testimony of this one person.
Correct. A person whose credibility the source heavily questions. They essentially present these two claims, reliant on Herbert's testimony from '86, as the entirety of the connection Democrats try to draw between Sessions and racism based on those hearings.
So summing up the source's perspective then.
It's really clear. They portray the accusations of racism against Jeff Sessions as basically a fairy tale, lacking real evidence.
Based on what remarks taken out of context, twisted comments from 1986.
Exactly. And promoted, they argue, by the mainstream media and Democrats purely for political reasons, relying on, as the source sees it, people not thinking critically or not knowing enough about civics.
And the source counters this by saying, Sessions' actual record over 30 years doesn't show racism.
Right. They even point to him prosecuting KKK members or getting civil judgments against them, trying to paint him as someone who believes firmly in the rule of law, not racial bias.
So, thinking about this whole analysis from the source, it's a really dedicated effort, isn't it, to build this alternative narrative, challenging the origins, the evidence, suggesting it's all weak and politically driven.
Absolutely. And you see the methods. Reframing that KKK remark as a joke, arguing the VRA stance was about the law's structure and actually beneficial, discrediting the accuser for other claims, and then just outright endorsing the criticism of civil rights groups. That's how they tried to debunk the racism label.
Yeah. Which brings us to the really interesting part, I think. This source makes some pretty strong claims about media bias, about the public not knowing enough, about political agendas driving all this.
It does.
So when you, the listener, are faced with these incredibly sharp, conflicting narratives about a public figure, where the context, the intent, even the basic credibility of everyone involved is so fiercely debated.
Yeah, how do you navigate that? How do you even begin to evaluate the information coming from such different sides? What tools do you personally use to assess not just the claims themselves, but the methods these sources use to build their case?